point in my career, I've published on pretty much every aspect of Spartan society. So a few years ago, I was asked to contribute a paper to a conference on austerity. And when I began to delve into the issue of Spartan austerity, I almost immediately regretted my decision to write on this topic. I had the sinking feeling that I had taken on far more than I could handle, and that I had vastly underestimated the complexity of this issue. Austerity, after all, is a complex term, given that its synonyms include strictness, seriousness, solemnity, gravity, frugality, thrift, economy, self-discipline, abstinence, sobriety, restraint, chastity, self-denial, sparseness, and starkness, and it goes on. Now, this broadening of the definition in no way renders the term austerity meaningless, for a few concepts link the above synonyms, and I want you to be thinking about these concepts during my talk today. All of the synonyms that I just gave you involve, to varying degrees, a combination of restriction, self-abnegation, and severity. The very richness of the term austerity helps to explain the many contexts in which it appears in scholarship on ancient Sparta and in ancient works on Sparta, especially in connection with the institution of the messes. And I'm going to use a Greek word here, syssidia. These were the sort of mess halls where Spartan men ate together and actually ended up living together. This term also appears in accounts of the consumption of food and drink, clothing and adornment, and the training of young Spartan males. Is there, however, adequate evidence for Spartan austerity? Now, this is a question that is surely warranted when we consider the strength and durability of what I'm going to call the Spartan mirage. And this is something I work on. What do I mean by Spartan mirage? This is the distorted or entirely imaginary literary tradition about ancient Sparta, what Sparta was, achieved, and stood for. Now, although austerity long remained a key feature of the Spartan mirage, we should not assume that austerity did not operate in historical Sparta. Whether or not the Spartans themselves exaggerated its centrality to their way of life, and other Greeks distorted the image of the austere Sparta for their own ends. As I argue in my forthcoming publication, austerity played an important role in the Spartans' construction and maintenance of their identity, both at home and abroad. But I do something very different from previous scholars who have traditionally viewed Spartan austerity as an institution that aimed to tamp down display. What I'm going to argue on the contrary is that the Spartans' particular brand of austerity was at once publicly oriented, highly performative, and competitive. Spartan austerity, perhaps counterintuitively, not only failed to discourage display, but rather encouraged a unique form of ostentation in its performance in a variety of contexts. Today, I will consider the role that austerity performed in all aspects of the Spartan's life, from the battlefield to the assembly, and from the upbringing to the disposal of the dead. Given its spectacular function and its constitution as a site for competition, it is not surprising that austerity was routinely performed in the public realm. Now, throughout this study, I privileged the classical sources on Spartan austerity, which, although they're often tendentious, both either for or against ancient Sparta, they at least have the benefit of both geographical and chronological proximity to classical Sparta. So first, we're going to look at austerity on the battlefield. And I want you to look at number one on my handout. And by the way, I had to put the Greek on there because A, it's beautiful. And this is what I do. I read lots and lots of Greek for my work. Okay, so one of our earliest references to Spartan austerity is also one of the thorniest pieces of evidence that I deal with. Now, this episode does not actually occur on the battlefield, but it takes place in the context of warfare, in this case, during the aftermath of the famous Battle of Plataea against the Persians in 479. Now, in this well-known passage, the 5th century BCE historian Herodotus recounts the Spartan regent Pausanias's use of Xerxes' tent, this is the Persian Xerxes' tent, to provide lessons on the Persians' folly in their attack on the impoverished Greeks. So you can take a look at this the handout as I'm talking to you. In its focus on the Spartans' reputed disdain for wealth and luxury, This passage seems to offer an early example of what would later become a common refrain on Spartan simplicity and self-abnegation. I would argue, however, that Herodotus here is providing an early portrait of what I'm going to call the Spartan spectacular austerity, as he recounts Pausanias's painstaking recreation of a Persian royal banquet that is to be set side by side with a Spartan dinner, in Greek, a lakonikon deipnon. Now, Herodotus, it should be noted, does not go into detail about the components of either the Persian meal or the Laconian repast. Nevertheless, it seems likely that he and his audience would have been familiar with at least the outlines of the Spartans' famously austere diet. The 5th century BCE Athenian comic poet Aristophanes certainly knew enough of the infamous black broth. And we're talking about blood soup, if that does not sound yummy yum to everybody here. Okay, he knew about the soup, or this broth, that was served in the common messes, the Syssidia, enough to be able to make a pun on the Spartan treat in his comedy, The Knights, in 424 BCE, which he composed while Herodotus may still have been revising his own histories. The spectacular nature of the scene becomes clear as Herodotus, through Pausanias's eyes, guides his audience's gaze from the Persians' gold, silver, and sumptuous decorations and magnificent feast to the unadorned Spartan meal, which was composed mostly of subsistence foodstuffs like barley meal. Pausanias' spectacle at the same time does important work for its internal and what I'm going to call its textual audiences, the first of which consisted of Pausanias' fellow Spartans. For these Spartans, the scene of dueling banquets provides a highly visual reminder of the institution of the mess hall, the Syssidion, which I'm going to talk about more in my talk later, and its promotion of the egalitarian and communitarian ethic that underpin Sparta's famed good laws. In Greek, we call that eunomia. The display also performed a key function in terms of the Spartans' relations with a second set of spectators of the display, namely the other Greeks at Plataea, as represented by the generals whom Pausanias summoned to watch his staged contest between poverty and excess. Through his performance of Spartan austerity, Pausanias engages his fellow Greeks in what I'm going to call a competition for bragging rights to victory over the Persians. By representing the Greeks' defeat of the Persians as the triumph of austerity over luxury and casting the Spartan meal as the Greek lead in this play, Pausanias here effectively identifies austere Sparta as the city-state, the polis, most responsible for driving Xerxes out of Greece. At Plataea, in other words, I'm arguing, austerity functions for the Spartans as a mode of both display and competition. Now, Herodotus and other sources suggest that the Spartans likewise competed in austerity, both among themselves and with other Greeks on the actual battlefield. Now, if we expand the definition of austerity to include those concepts with which it is constantly equated or at least linked, especially those denoting restraint or self-denial, I think my case is pretty strong. The evidence that best supports this theory concerns a Spartan coward by the name of Aristodamus. And this is, we're coming up there on number 2 on your handout. Okay, so according to Herodotus, this Spartiate managed to avoid the Battle of Thermopylae. I hope you've heard about the Battle of Thermopylae, where the 300 are victorious. And we're told that he avoided it either because he suffered from inflammation of the eyes or because he didn't want to be there and he loitered on his way to send a message. Now, upon his return to Sparta, Herodotus tells that Aristodamus experienced abuse and dishonor at the hands of his fellow Spartiates. No one would light a fire for him or converse with him, and they called him Aristodamus the Trembler. In Greek, it's tressos, Aristodamus the tressos, trembler meaning a shaker. That's the term for coward. In an attempt to redeem his honor, Aristodamus, according to Herodotus, apparently threw himself into battle and died at the Battle of Plataea the following year. Now, particularly relevant here, and this is number 2 on your handout, is Herodotus's discussion of Aristodamus in his account of those soldiers who had acquitted themselves courageously at Plataea. This description of Aristodamus's dishonor reveals a great deal, not only about the Spartans' insistence on preserving discipline and order on the field, but also about their primary valuation of group solidarity. In his selfish desire to die in order to expiate his guilt for surviving the Battle of Thermopylae, Aristodamus did something you are never supposed to do as a Spartan. He abandoned his place in the phalanx, and he thereby endangered his fellow hoplites. And this is where I argue the issue of austerity comes in. The cooperative ethic that ensured the cohesion and survival of the Spartan phalanx demanded both incredible self-discipline and self-abnegation on the part of individual soldiers. Personal wishes, desires, ambitions, fear, that would be me. I would have been a terrible Spartan soldier. All of these things were to be tamped down to the point of non-existence. Even if the Spartans could never fully eradicate selfishness or the envy possibly harbored by Aristodemus's fellow Spartans. Herodotus emphasizes this demand for what I'm going to call emotional austerity in his repeated claim that the Spartans failed to honor Aristodemus after Plataea precisely because of his selfish desire to die. So what I'm arguing here is that warfare, which is a wholly cooperative enterprise, provided the Spartans with yet another stage on which to display their superiority in austerity. Okay, now what I'm going to do is talk about how austerity operated in citizen life and death. Okay, so self-discipline and self-denial in the field were, of course, instilled in those Spartan hoplites throughout their lives, as the ancient evidence on Spartan austerity amply demonstrates. Now, given the scope of this paper, it is impossible to rehearse all of the evidence. The study, my study, focuses on key moments in the Spartan male life cycle, beginning with their notoriously severe upbringing. Now, the 5th century BCE Athenian historian Thucydides, and this is number 3 on your handout, has 2 key figures address Spartan education early in his work, which we call the history. In his account of the famous debate at Sparta in 431, this is the debate where the Spartans are figuring out whether they're going to go to war with Athens, okay? In this debate, he has one of Sparta's 2 hereditary kings, this is Archidamus II, offer a eulogy of Spartan training that emphasizes both its severity and its austerity. Archidamus's treatment of the Spartan system is immediately striking in terms of its characterization of the Spartans, in terms of their self-mastery and avoidance of excess. Unlike their Athenian opponents, and by the way, everyone should know I hate Athens because I am a Sparta specialist, okay? He says, unlike those Athenians, the Spartans proved capable of resisting the obvious attraction of and danger posed by uncontrolled rhetoric, education, and cleverness. They would hate Reedies, we're just simply too clever. Their particular training, which pairs severity and self-control, allows them to restrict their indulgence in the kind of learning that would threaten success in war. Equally noteworthy is Archidamus's later description of this education. In his claim at, this is in 184.4, the superiority lies with the one who is reared in, and this is in the Greek, entois anakaiotatos. While modern texts have generally translated the Greek as, quote, the severest school, I think that's really wrong. The terminology suggests that Archidamus here is tapping into the range of concepts that the term austerity encapsulates. The Spartans, according to their king, are trained not only in severity, but also if we exploit the multivalency of the adjective anakaios, austerity, by extreme force, amidst the greatest constraints, and with the barest of necessities. Thucydides' Pericles, the Athenian Pericles, Athens leader, offers a similar assessment of Spartan paideia, or training, as extremely severe in his funeral oration, and this is number 4 on your handout. In this section of his speech, Pericles seems to respond to the Spartan king's praise for the Spartan system in his comparison of the Athenian democracy's promotion of the natural talents of its citizens to the Spartans' rigorous schooling and obedience that was painful, involved endless toil and hardship, and bordered on asceticism. Now that sounds like a Reed education, no? We can talk about this later. Okay, so We're now going to turn to our next source, and this is the 4th century Athenian historian Xenophon, who I'm working on a lot these days in various publications. Xenophon helps to explain why the Spartan form of education was at once so painful and severe in his account of the Spartan upbringing in his work on Spartan society, which in Greek is called the Lacedaemonian Politeia. Now, according to Xenophon, the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus aimed to toughen Spartan boys by forcing them to go about barefoot, allowing them one garment throughout the year, and restricting their food rations. Through such provisions, he argues, the Spartans attempted to make the young men nimble, able to endure changes of heat and cold, and also made them slender. Later authors likewise comment on the austere education of boys, adding details such as on their sparse bedding and their need to steal to supplement their diets. Now, austerity apparently continued to play a central role in the lives of adult Spartan males who, according to Xenophon and later authors, were obliged to dress simply and not expend resources on cloaks. In addition, once he reached adulthood at the age of 20 or 21, every Spartan male was elected to one of Sparta's common messes. I've talked about this before. This in Greek are known as the Syssidia. And this is when a Spartan male became a full-fledged citizen warrior. Now here too, the Spartan male had restricted access to both food and drink, a situation that the late 5th century Athenian Critias, who we call a lacanophile, a Sparta lover, warmly praises in surviving fragments from his dual verse and prose treatises entitled The Polity of the Lacedaemonians. And this is number 5 on your handout. In one of these fragments, Critias notes that the Spartans differ from their fellow Greeks in both their abstention from drinking toast or games and their consumption of only enough wine to promote good cheer, friendliness, and temperate laughter. Appropriate levels of both eating and drinking, according to Critias, promote clear thought and labor. Xenophon in handout number 6 likewise attests to restrictions on food in the mess halls in the Syssidia, the abolition of drinking games, and the prevention of inebriation. He then goes on to claim that the messes kept men from destructive gluttony and drunkenness, not only by limiting consumption, but also by combining men of different ages in the Syssidia in order to encourage the older Spartans to use these gatherings to educate their younger compatriots. Plutarch, who's a 2nd century CE Greek biographer, goes even further in his claim that boys attended the messes as if they were, quote, schools in temperance, replete with educational spectacles. Spartans walking back to their barracks, this is what Xenophon tells us, after these meals were to provide a further display of self-control by comporting themselves appropriately, even without the benefit of a torch to guide them, meaning they cannot be drunk if they want to get home or back to their barracks. Now, in his account of the dining that occurred in the Syssidion, Plutarch again highlights the spectacular and competitive nature of Spartan austerity. He claims that the Spartans drastically diverged from other Greeks who, quote, put themselves into the hands of servants and cooks to be fattened under cover of darkness like gluttonous animals. The Spartans instead dined under the intense scrutiny of their messmates, who reproached the ones who proved impotent and too weak for the common diet. Just as with the upbringing, I'm arguing, Spartan drinking and dining were veritable spectator sports performed under the surveillance of the community. Okay, so if we're to believe Xenophon in his Lacedaemonian Politeia, where he talks about all kinds of Spartan customs, food and drink were not the only necessities that the Spartans limited in their attempt to create a disciplined citizenry with restrained appetites. Their regimen of austerity also included sexual intercourse, if you can imagine this, at least in the case of heterosexual encounters between those Spartan males who were still living in the barracks and their wives who were at home. This is number 7 on your handout. So according to Xenophon, unlike husbands and other polis who could have unlimited intercourse with their wives, these young Spartans spent the bulk of their time with other males in the barracks and only occasionally made furtive visits to their wives under cover of darkness. According to Xenophon, this restriction aimed to increase sexual desire among the couples and to produce children that would be more vigorous than those born of couples who were sexually sated with one another. What is so striking in this account is the public nature of the restriction on sexual activity. If we can believe Xenophon, sexual self-denial did not occur in the marital bed, but rather in the barracks where young Spartan husbands displayed their self-control in front of one another through their infrequent visits to their wives. So austerity, okay, so it not just involved food, drink, and sex. It did not just accompany Spartans through their lives, but it also accompanied them into their graves. And this is number 8 on your handout. Plutarch's accounts of Spartan burial customs is in line with archaeological evidence, which demonstrates that both the burial and commemoration of deceased non-royal Spartans were also austere in the extreme, unlike the burials of other Greeks. Okay. And what's interesting in this passage is that Plutarch emphasizes the ideological and visual power in his claim that Lycurgus allowed burials within the polis, within the city. They're normally supposed to be outside the city walls, and the placement of like markers near sacred places. The idea being that burials provided yet another striking display of Spartan austerity through their very simplicity. So we have again, austerity on public display, even in death. Okay, my next section, and again, I may have to truncate because I don't want to go on too long, but I want to talk about austerity in the political setting, in the assembly, and in Spartan speech. Okay, so given the many roles that austerity played in aspects of Spartan male life, we shouldn't be surprised that it performed key functions in political life. So in his account of that debate at Sparta that I've already talked about, Thucydides recounts another spectacle of Spartan austerity when he has Aristodamus speak. Here, however, the Spartans compete both against themselves and their Athenian opponents, and the currency of contestation is not food, as it was in the case of those dueling banquets I talked about, but now the currency is speech, or more specifically, the Spartans' famed, and I love this term, brachology, or brevity of speech that has given rise to the modern term laconic, something no one has ever accused me of, I hate to say. Okay, so Thucydides has the Spartan king Aristodamus and another Spartan talk at this debate. And both of them, I'm going to argue, not only talk about austere speech, they actually perform it as well. Okay, so Aristodamus gives us a speech that, as you saw, is very pithy. He avoids syntactical complexity. Okay, Aristodamus also, remember, he's talking about self-control. He doesn't want Spartans running into war, but nowhere is Spartan austerity more on display. Again, that was in number 3 earlier, than in his pithy eulogy of their training and character. Remember, Spartians are not trained to make long speeches. Okay, this is not what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be focusing on being successful on the battlefield. Now, after he concludes his speech, Thucydides introduces the last speaker in this debate, an otherwise unknown Spartan official. He's an ephor known as Sthenelaidas. This is number 9 on your handout. Now, at immediate glance, you may say, Ellen, he is not austere or self-controlled because he gives us this violent harangue against the Athenians, and he calls for swift action against Athenian aggression. Okay, granted, his speech is violent, but I'm going to argue that this Spartan too puts on a spectacular display of austerity in both his rhetorical style and his attack on the Athenians' excessive wordplay. His speech is remarkably stark, straightforward in style, and by far it is the shortest speech in the entirety of Thucydides' history. In essence, theory again meets practice, as the Spartan Sthenelaidas displays an austerity in words that demonstrates the superiority of Spartan brachology over Athenian macrology. So you have brevity of speech over length of speech. Okay. Now, granted, as I and others have argued, Thucydides here is reflecting a stereotype of the taciturn, rhetorically inept Spartan. Okay, now Athenian authors' interest in Spartan speech and generally hostile treatment of it, I will tell you, invite a healthy dose of skepticism. But I think that a kernel of truth may lie behind 5th century exaggerated representations of Spartans who are bad speakers. I'm going to argue that the Spartans themselves may have cultivated laconic speech, not only in their dealings with other Greeks, but also in communications amongst themselves. Brevity in speech could prove both powerful and useful. And I want you to take a look at number 10 on your handout. So several authors suggest that the Spartans actually did engage in what I'm going to call brachology, brevity of speech, right, as a weapon. In his Protagoras, the 4th century Athenian philosopher Plato, this is number 10 on your handout, likens the Spartans' terse speech to a javelin. He then asserts that there were many thinkers who admired the Spartans for their terseness of speech and viewed it as a sign of wisdom. Now, whether you believe or not that Spartans are wise in terms of their austerity, Plato is clearly associating brachology with Sparta as something very purposeful. He goes even further in his later laws published on the 350s BCE, where he claims, and this is number 11 on your handout, that all Greeks share our belief that while our own city, Athens, is both fond and full of speech, Lacedaemon, which is the other name for Sparta, is given to brevity and discourse, while Crete is inclined to cleverness rather than wordiness. And what I find so interesting about this is that brevity in speech is setting the Spartans apart from other Greeks. And I would argue that it may have constituted an ancient form of branding in which the Spartans were, in a sense, honing their verbal skills, right? And they wanted to be famous for their brevity of speech, especially against whom the Athenians, they were locked in a hegemonic contest for much of the period that I'm considering today, okay? So the Spartans here, right, setting themselves apart, we saw before, setting themselves apart as the real victors against Persia, right, because of their austerity, and again, in their language, setting themselves apart from other Greeks. Now, Thucydides' Spartans, however, right, not only do they, I would argue, go against the Athenians, but I would argue that Sthenelaidas in the speech is also in competition with the king, okay? In his far greater brevity, brusqueness, and hostility toward long speeches, I would argue that this effort, this official Sthenelaidas, is casting himself as the real Spartan at this speech, the one who deserves to win the debate. And guess what? He is the one who wins the debate. Okay, so here I am concluding, and I'm sorry I'm going a couple minutes over time. What I'm hoping you saw today is that the sources make it clear that austerity long enjoyed power as a central component of the Spartan brand, okay, the austere Spartan. And this austere Spartan, what I would argue, doesn't just occur during the period we're talking about, 5th and 4th century, but what's even more interesting is that when the Spartans over time, and this is going on in the 4th and 3rd centuries, give up a lot of their traditional customs, like their upbringing. In the 3rd century, in the middle of the 3rd century, we hear about 2 reforming kings who want to return Sparta to their glory days. What I would argue, they want to rebrand Sparta as a sort of almost like the return of austerity, with the idea that that is going to set Sparta apart from all the other powers in the ancient world. And that's it, my friends. I hope you enjoyed it today, and I welcome all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Ellen. The first question I have is austerity a Greek word? And if not, what is the Greek?
So there are a bunch of Greek terms that one uses, and the Greek term that I'm using, it's the term that comes up in, and I'm going to see if I can find it on my handout. it's the idea of being, and listen to me, I'm like looking for this, for the one term, anakaios, which almost is like necessity, narrowness. There's not really one term. That term can mean like severe. I would argue that is the closest term to anything that we have for austerity. So it's not that we necessarily have terms, it's more that we have practices, if that makes some sense. Austerity, we have practices, but we don't really have necessarily one single noun that's going to cover all these practices, if that makes some sense.
Thank you. The next question, I'll read it to you. Modern militaries, including the American military, emphasize many attributes of Spartan austerity, but they also in significant ways emphasize elaborate ceremonies, as with promotions and retirements. Uniforms are adorned with numerous battle ribbons. What do you make of this combination? And contemporary militaries are very hierarchical. Was that true of Sparta?
Okay. Well, first of all, the Spartans had ceremonies too. They wouldn't be recognizable. So we're told, for example, by our sources that before the Spartans would go into battle, they would sit and comb their hair. That may sound really, really weird to you, but the Spartans were famous for their long hair. And the Spartans, by the way, were told by several sources that they're also unusual because they all wore the exact same military kit when they went into battle. Anyone who's interested, I wrote a long piece on Spartan Hoplite warfare. I can even send you the piece if you're interested. But they were told that when they went into battle, it was like a sea of scarlet and bronze. And so they did have certain kinds of ceremonies. Hierarchy, oh yeah, there's a hierarchy, trust me. First of all, when you're in the hoplite phalanx, you would put a wuss like me. Where do you think a wuss like me would go? And I am. You think I'd fight in a hoplite phalanx? I'd be the one running away crying, okay? A wuss like me would have been put in the middle. I would put the bravest person in front, and I would put another very brave person in the back. So imagine I'm looking at Jan Carpenter here, and I'm looking, people I know, Carol Hawkins. Imagine we're in a phalanx together. I would put Carol at the front. I think Carol's really sort of frightening. Sorry, Carol. I would be somewhere in the middle, and I think Jan would be at the back, pushing me on, being like, Ellen, don't be a weenie. So, and there's a tremendous chain of command that we know about from Xenophon when they go into battle. That's a long, complicated issue. But if you're interested, I can send you my article. That came out in 2016. I can send you. It has all the references if you're interested.
The next question is modern poetry, like that of Reed's Mary Barnard, more Spartan than Athenian?
We really have very little. If you're thinking about poetry, do you know how much Spartan poetry we have? Next to none. We have the poetry we have is from Tyrtaeus, really early lyric poet from 8th century. So I wouldn't even make that comparison. I mean, the Spartans, we have very little left of Spartan writings. The Athenians were highly unusual in leaving us a tremendous amount of written text. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's my answer there.
Going back to what you said about Spartans not sleeping regularly with their wives, were there divorces among the Spartans more or less than Athenians?
We don't hear, wouldn't it be great if a text came up like a divorce manual, an ancient Spartan divorce manual? No, we don't hear about divorce. We just don't. And I have to tell you, I think Spartan marriages, my husband's going to think this is going to come out as a very problematic answer. I think if you're a Spartan female, if you don't like your husband, it's not a terrible problem. Where do you think your husband spends most of his time, people? He's off fighting most of the time, right? I'm in charge of the household. So if I don't like, and I love my husband, anyone who's met my husband will tell you he's a great guy. So I'm not reflecting anything here, but we don't have evidence of divorces. We simply don't. But really, Spartan women, I've argued in my work on Spartan women, actually had so much more time and control over their households probably than Athenian women did, because their men are out fighting all the time.
The next one says, interesting to think about Reformation Christianity and its relationship to the Roman Church with respect to this Spartan/Athenian competition. To what degree was Spartan culture, in addition to that of Athens, an aspect of the educated person's consciousness in the 14th and 15th century?
I'm not sure I fully, I fully understand the question. Can you repeat that again, Santi?
Sure. It's interesting to think about Reformation Christianity and its relationship to the Roman Church with respect to this Spartan and Athenian competition. To what degree was Spartan culture, in addition to that of Athens, an aspect of the educated person's consciousness in the 14th and 15th centuries?
Not Sparta. Not Sparta. You would have people of this period looking more toward Athens, and certainly looking more toward Rome. They would not have been looking at Sparta. Sparta, if you're ever interested in what I would call the Nachleben of Sparta, and looking at the influence of Sparta on later periods, a wonderful work. Where is it? And I can find, here it is. It's a fabulous book. This is Elizabeth Rawson, who taught me at Oxford. It's the Spartan tradition in European thought. Really interesting to see who looked to Sparta for models. We have sometimes problematic people looking back, like Hitler, for example, and the Germans, who liked a lot of aspects about Sparta, but like could not wrap their heads around, for example, institutionalized pederasty. So you might find that a really interesting work. And again, her name is Elizabeth Rawson, Rawson. Really interesting if you want to know about, in a sense, Spartan influence on European thought.
Thank you. Is there any evidence that Spartan hoplites were really better soldiers than
Oh my
Athenian
God, are you
hoplites?
serious? Sorry. Absolutely. The Spartans were, again, if you want to read this piece, and I can send it to you, Santi, you can send it on to everybody. The Spartans were the masters of hoplite warfare. Okay, hoplite warfare, when I teach Greek history, you should come. Some people in here, I don't know if some people here are present, but who've been in my Greek history class have seen me. I put together a phalanx. In order to have a phalanx work, you can't have people stepping out of order or thinking about themselves. In a matter, it's group think. And the city-state that created tremendous homogeneity and solidarity doesn't mean that there weren't fissures and cracks in the system, was Sparta. And that's why the Spartans were so much better on the field than other Greeks, all to the point where we have sources that tell us that when an army would literally see the lambdas, I wish I could show you, I've got a Spartan shield up here, when they would see the lambdas of the lambda for Lacedaemon on the shields approaching, they would practically pee in their pants and run away rather than face the Spartans in war. Oh, they absolutely, in hoplite warfare, absolutely the best practitioners. They were, Xenophon calls them the only professionals, whereas the rest were amateurs in warfare.
Thank you. The next question, why were Spartan women called, quote, thigh showers?
Oh, thigh flashers?
Thigh flashers?
Phynomerides. Oh my God, that's such a great word. Okay, I wish I could do a little flashing of thigh. I don't know if you'd want to see my thigh, but we're told that when they exercised, right, they would wear what are called kitaniskoi, which means a little chiton, short, because think about it, when you go to the gym, would you want to be wearing a long dress, right? So in order to exercise, they're flashing a little thigh. And that gets used against them. We hear of authors like Euripides basically says because they dressed this way, they were essentially promiscuous. That's in Euripides' play, The Andromache, around 425 BCE.
Thank you. What do you think of Pressfield's Gates of Fire?
So, you know, I mean, I'm glad that I've met him. I was at a conference with him. He's a very, very nice guy. It's better. It's okay. I mean, what I think concerns me is that it in a sense gives into some of that mirage about Sparta, which I think is simply just not true. But I appreciate it because I think it has very much increased public interest in Sparta, which I think is a good thing for me, is always a good thing. Certainly better than the movie The 300, which is an outrageous piece of garbage. But that's anyway, that's just me. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Did any of you produce The 300? Now I've offended somebody. Okay, I'll have to be quiet now.
So Ellen, are you up for a couple more questions?
Oh my God, love them.
So those are the questions I've had submitted via the chat. Does anyone else want to jump in with a question at this time?
No one. I love questions.
I see a hand raised. Jim Kahn.
Yeah. To what extent was the Spartan military sort of like the German high command in that they would be giving mission directed orders? The units would be told to achieve something rather than being told how to achieve it.
Oh no! Oh, we know. Well, I mean, this is hard, but we know that there was a. Oh no, there's a chain of command. We also have we have speeches. We have a number of speeches of Spartan commanders in the context of battle, in Herodotus, in Thucydides, and in Xenophon, right? Of Spartan commanders telling their troops exactly what they're supposed to do. And we also know, I mean, the Spartans, again, were tremendously talented, that we're told that they could be given the command, and that there's such an organized chain of command that they could literally be turned to wheel. Can you imagine a whole line being told to turn? I don't know about you, but if I'm even in a dance line and I'm supposed to turn with other people, I can't do it, but that they could literally wheel left, wheel right, and literally turn all the way around upon command. So we have a lot of evidence that tells us it's not just how, it's what you're supposed to be doing and why.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So Ellen, two more questions.
Yeah.
First, I'll go to this one, and then I see Mark's hand is raised. So this person says, I'm going on the re-college trip to Greece. Sometime it was just postponed. Is Sparta worth visiting? I'm told it's a pile of rocks.
So I know Wally was supposed to lead the trip, and I led one a couple of years ago. That's why I have some very, very dear friends here. You know, Sparta is an interesting one. Sparta itself is a dump. I mean, I really hate saying that. But the city of Sparta itself is not the most attractive, but there's a wonderful site right near called Mistra, which is Byzantine, which is really rather gorgeous and worth visiting. And I think Sparta is worth visiting in the sense that what's so stunning when you go to Sparta is that when you're in the valley, the idea that this small group of people, and I'm not lauding them, please understand this, but they controlled, remember, they had helots. Helots were forced workers, right? You could argue forced sharecroppers, essentially slaves for the Spartans, all the way across this huge mountain range. I mean, it's utterly remarkable. So I think, you know, when if you want to really understand what's going on with let's say Athens versus Sparta, like if I were to lead a trip, I'm hoping I will lead another alumni trip to Greece. I am definitely going to Sparta. How do I not go to Sparta? You know, I would also go to Thermopylae. I took Jan went with me to Thermopylae, and it was cool as hell. So anyway, I would go, but the modern city, it's, you know, there's not a lot, but Mistra next door is fabulous. So I would do it. Should I pressure Wally to take you guys to Sparta?
The next question, I'm going to call on Mark Johnson. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about fundamental motivations of such a culture, since it seems to be so devoted to conquest and violence. And so, do you see a difference in the Spartans' relationship to the Greek deities when compared to that of, say, the Athenians or the Cretans and other Greek societies?
That's an interesting question. I would say no, in terms of, I mean, remember, every Greek polis had a, there's basically a set of Greek gods, and which ones matter in which city are different. So in Sparta, it's Athena of the brazen house, and we have Hera, etc. I would say no, it's not about how they worship. In fact, if anything was so interesting about Sparta, the Spartans were more religious. All the evidence they have in the ancient world tells us that in many ways the Spartans were much more concerned to follow religious religious customs. Like for example, can you imagine that at one point they are literally about to fight a battle? They stop. We're told by Xenophon, they stop within eyesight of the opposing army to sacrifice to make sure everything is okay. Why they are so focused on battle and preparation, I think a lot of people would argue it's because in the 9th to 8th centuries, down into the 7th century, they'd conquered this huge group of people known as the Helots, and they basically have to keep that whole part of the world under their control. And it's very, very important. And think about it, right? Unlike other Greeks who have to spend most of their time farming, creating goods, the Spartans spend all their time. I mean, if you're a Spartan male, you're either involved in politics or you're out training or you are fighting. So a lot of it really has to do about the way that their city-state develops early on, that explains why. I mean, they're likened to an armed camp. I think that's a little extreme, but they are more focused on warfare. I mean, no reasonable scholar would disagree with that than other Greeks are. I hope that, again, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So Ellen, I would say I have two final questions, if that works for you.
Absolutely.
The first is, did Spartan women receive military training?
No. I wish. No, all that we know is that the Spartan women exercised more than girls elsewhere in the Greek world. And you'll have some, shall I say, irresponsible scholars who'll tell you because the Spartans wanted their women to be emancipated and free. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about eugenics. Spartan girls exercise more. They marry later because they're meant to produce healthy, young Spartan girls who will become mothers, and boys will become Spartan soldiers. So no, we've no evidence of them ever being trained for battle.
Thank you. And then the final question, which is actually a nice wrap up. There's interest in the story of how you came to focus on Spartan culture, preferring it over other areas or interests.
Okay, no, that's really a great question. So when I went to grad school, after I went to Brown, and then after Brown, I went to Penn. I went to Oxford. I did a second BA at Oxford. That's where I knew I wanted to do ancient history. And then when I went to University of Pennsylvania, I really thought I was going to work on Athens. And then I took my first year at Penn, I took a graduate seminar on Herodotus. And that professor, by complete chance, focused on 2 books of Herodotus that focus a lot on Sparta. And I'm going to sound like a weirdo, and I am a weirdo, and I'm proud of being weird, but then you all went to read, so you're weirdos too, okay? I thought Sparta was the coolest thing ever. And I began to notice that Sparta seemed, at least in this one work, like that he was making Sparta seem weird, bizarre, almost like something non-Greek. And that's my basic work. I mean, so I'm fundamentally an intellectual historian. I've ended up becoming a social historian, a military historian, an economic historian. I work on everything on Sparta, but my core research is on the Athenian construction of the Sparta, in a sense, how the image, what kind of work the Spartans are doing among Athenians in 5th century Athens. So, and I fell in love with it, and I have been in love with it ever since. And I feel remarkably lucky that I get paid to work on something that continues to just fascinate me.
Thank you so much. Oh yeah, please go ahead, whoever's chiming in.
This is Barbara West. I just want to thank you, Ellen, for your lecture. It was fascinating, and I will view Spartans differently from now on.
Oh, thank you. And I want to say something, by the way, Reed, no one asked me about Reed, but I've had no students work with me on Sparta. They all seem to love Homer. Who knows? So I'm teaching Homer again this semester, but it's been a great pleasure teaching at Reed. And I can tell you, I love leading Reed trips. I think Reed alums are the best. So it's been a great pleasure talking to all of you today. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to write to me. Any questions or any articles, I'll be happy to send information your way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ellen. We really appreciate your time. The Foster-Scholz Club steering committee is planning for an additional speaker next month in April, and we'll update the Reed website when that event is finalized. This recording will be available likely early next week on the Reed Remote website. We'll post it there. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending.